Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for coming to the Salmagundi Club. My name is Alexander Catlin. I'm the chairman of the Salmagundi Library, and I welcome you all, and I hope that you will come and visit the club many times. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Anthony Belov, who is a member of the Salmagundi Library and a board member of ARCE. So Anthony, if you would be our MC and take over.
Good evening, everybody. I must say, wonderful to see so many ARCE faces here. It's been a few years, hasn't it? At least for me. And just a quick anecdote before I turn the mic over to other much more important people. I was given a Great Courses DVD set years ago for my birthday, and I watched in rapt attention at this gentleman who was just talking about Egypt and all the stuff, and I'm just absorbing everything like a sponge. And I said, wow, who is this guy, Bob Brier? And I just wondered, gee, I wonder if I'd ever get to meet him. Well, fast forward 20 years later, and I've met Bob many times. But I'm not going to introduce Bob. Let me just say that as a member of both Salmagundi and ARCE, I have been very, very pleased to have acted as a sort of a bridge between the two organizations. What do ARCE and Salmagundi have in common? Basically nothing.
We do have archaeology books.
There are archaeology books that are as old as the tombs they discussed upstairs in the library. But when ARCE lost access to so many venues, and I was, to my honor, invited to join the board, I said, let me ask at Salmagundi and see if they would like to host some meetings here. And Alexander Catlin, jumped on it and said we were just talking about doing some archaeology. So for once in my life, the timing was perfect. And so I was very happy to serve as a bridge between the two organizations, and I hope that this is the start of a collaboration that will happily go far into the future. And now I'm going to turn it over to John Freed, who is the president of ARCE New York.
Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Anthony, thanks for the introduction, and Alex, thank you so much for all the work that you did to help Anthony and everybody put this together. I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brier. I have known Bob for, he tells me, 40 years now. I was one of his students many years ago at the New School, and since then Bob has done a lot of truly amazing things. He's been featured on CNN, and 60 Minutes, and numerous National Geographic documentaries. And he is the only person who has done an actual human mummification since, I don't know, somewhere around 300 AD, so almost 1,600 years. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bob Brier.
Let me say what I'm going to do, and then I'll try to do it. What I'll try to do is talk for about 40 minutes. I've got to watch here. I'm going to try to tell you something about Tutankhamun that you haven't heard. Most of you know that it's the 100th anniversary of Tutankhamun's discovery. And I was asked to do a book for Oxford University Press for the 100th anniversary. And I intended to do a book that was pretty straightforward. It was going to be a kind of survey of research that's been done on Tutankhamun fairly recently. Most people, know a little bit about the story of the discovery, and they think that once the objects are put in the museum in Cairo in the glass vitrines, that's the end of the story, but it's not. There's a lot more research that's been done, and it's still going on. So I tried to do this book, and it didn't turn out the way I thought it would. Nothing with Tutankhamun seems to be the way it's supposed to be. Okay, the story is a kind of made-for-movie story. And that's, I think, partly why there's still interest 100 years later in Tutankhamun. On the left, we have Howard Carter, the impoverished archaeologist, which may be a redundant phrase, but and on the right is Lord Carnarvon, right, the wealthy lord who was going to be his patron. Now, Carnarvon had an interesting distinction. He was involved in one of the earliest automobile crashes, period. Right? He liked fast things, he liked racehorses and cars, and he flipped his car and wound up in a ditch, which saved his life because his head was upside down and the ditch, gave him some room for his head. But he was injured, seriously injured, and he decided to recover in Egypt. He had no particular interest in Egypt, and he went to Egypt to recover, and he fell in love with the country. And he thought it would be an interesting idea if he could excavate. And those were the days when if you had a little money and some connections, you could excavate. But he needed an archaeologist. And this was common. You would have a wealthy patron and an archaeologist. At this time, Carter was unemployed. Right? He was a skilled archaeologist. He had been inspector of antiquities at Luxor, but at this point, unemployed. So they teamed up. And they agreed to excavate, and for years they excavated, I say 5 years, they excavated together with very little luck. Right? They found very little things. But then Carter knew. Carter was really experienced. He knew that Tutankhamun's tomb was missing. At the time before the discovery, Tutankhamun was hardly known. Just a name. Nobody knew he was a boy king. Nobody knew who his father was. Nobody knew where his tomb was. Hardly known. But Carter knew he was missing. And Carter wanted to excavate in the Valley of the Kings. But, he didn't have the concession. He didn't have permission to excavate in the valley. It was held by Theodore Davis, a wealthy American. Davis excavated for years and made important discoveries. And then, he found something related to Tutankhamun. He found a pit burial. And in the burial were jars with Tutankhamun's name on it. Bandages used in wrapping mummies with Tutankhamun's name on it. Also floral collars, pectorals, right? 6 of them. Kind of interesting accumulation of things. And Davis figured that he had found the plundered tomb of Tutankhamun. He was wrong. What he had found was the last meal of the mourners at Tutankhamun's funeral. The family had worn these pectorals, eaten a meal. That's why they were wine jars. That's why they were duck bones and things like that. And because they were part of the funeral, they were sacred. So they were buried. Right? So when Davis finds this, he's convinced he's got a plundered tomb of Tutankhamun, and he figures the valley is played out. He actually published his work as the Tomb of Tutankhamun, and in it, page 7, he says, "I fear the valley is now played out." And he gives up the concession. Carter knew what was happening. So Carter and Carnarvon jumped on the concession. They got the concession to excavate the Valley of the Kings. So they are specifically looking for Tutankhamun's tomb. It's not a matter of luck, it's a matter of skill and knowledge. So they start excavating. Now, why is Tutankhamun's tomb disappeared for all these years and every other tomb had been plundered? It's a simple answer. We're looking at a David Roberts painting from 1838 of the Valley of the Kings. These are tombs. These were open for literally thousands of years. And this is a tomb that's open during Roberts' time. It's the tomb of Ramses VI. Now, Tutankhamun's tomb, which we can't see because it hasn't been discovered yet, is right here. And the reason it hasn't been discovered is that a couple hundred years when they're doing the tomb of Ramses VI, the workmen have to carry out the rubble. They're carving into the mountain. So they're carrying out the rubble. They don't want to carry it any further than they have to, and they dump it on Tutankhamun's tomb. And Tutankhamun's tomb disappears. That's why Tut is undiscovered till 1922. This is the actual photo of the scene. That is Ramses VI. That's Tut. So you can see it's an easy haul for the workers to take the rubble, the chips, and just dump them on top of this tomb. And Tutankhamun disappears from history. Now, when Carter and Carnarvon finally get to the antechamber, it's called, the first room where there's treasure, that's the scene where Carter makes a little hole in the wall. He's holding up a candle. It flickers because the hot air is coming out of the tomb. And Carnarvon says, can you see anything? And Carter says the famous, yes, wonderful things, right? And these are the wonderful things that he sees. The reason the tomb is so packed, right, is that the Egyptians were resurrectionists. They believed you could take it with you, literally. They were going to get up and go again in the next world, so you'd need everything. So what we have here, for example, these white little cases here contain ducks. That's an order to go. That's Tutankhamun's move to the next world. That's what it is. And over here, that's a funerary couch. That's part of the ritual, and it's very high. You can see the legs are long, and the body was on this, and rituals were formed, and the reason it's high is so that the priest doesn't have to bend over. It's kind of high, and he can do it. There are 3 of these, and I think you can see the tail of one, that's another couch, and the head here of another. So this thing is chock-a-block with treasures. I mean, absolutely packed. And, you know, that's part of the reason everybody's attracted to Tutankhamun. It's all the treasures, everywhere the glint of gold. You know. Now, what I want to tell you about is a couple of detours I had to take with this book that I wrote. And the first one involves mummies. Now, I'm a mummy person. That's my specialty. Almost all Egyptologists have specialties, and mine is mummies. And this book came out in 2016, and it presented something new about Tutankhamun. Really new. He had a club foot, right? So that's where it appears. He had a club foot. And it even goes so far as to say he may have walked on the side of his foot. That it was pronounced. So for many years, since 2016, everybody's talking about the fragile pharaoh. Tut really had a difficult life. And they also talk about that's why there are so many walking sticks and canes in Tut's tomb. That's one of the canes. It's kind of cool. That's a Nubian. It's the enemy, and whenever Tut walked, he would put his hand on squeezing the Nubian, the prisoner. Now, so it makes sense. If you had a club foot, you would have lots of walking canes and staves and things like that. But it's wrong. It's wrong. Walking sticks and staves were signs of authority. And we often see reliefs, paintings, tomb paintings of officials with walking sticks. They're always shown with that. Didn't mean they needed them. It was a sign of authority. So the staves don't mean anything, right? But anyway, I felt that there was something wrong here. Let me explain why I thought there was something wrong about the club foot theory. First, I looked at the scan, the CAT scan. Didn't look like a club foot to me. And then I saw, when I went into the literature, I saw there's another orthopedic surgeon who wrote and said, doesn't look like a club foot to me. So what is going on, right? Now, let me show you what I think is going on. This is why I say it doesn't go the way you think sometimes. We are looking at Tutankhamun in his coffin, his gold coffin. 3 nested coffins, 2 wood, and the innermost one is solid gold, right? 320 pounds of gold.
Wow.
The mummy has been unwrapped, but it's stuck in the coffin. At the funeral, sacred oils were poured on Tutankhamun. And over the thousands of years, they've congealed, and he is now stuck in the bottom of the gold coffin. This is the gold mask, the famous gold mask, still on his head. They're going to have to take it off with heated knives. They tried all kinds of things, by the way, to take him out of the gold coffin. They brought the coffin up into the sun, hoping that the sun would heat the resins, things like that. It didn't work. They eventually had to really just practically rip him out of it. But the point I want to make is this about the club foot. There are sandals on Tutankhamun's. They're gold. They're solid gold sandals. Now the reason they're gold is the metal of immortality. It never tarnishes. So for example, the burial chamber in ancient Egypt was called the gold room. And if you wore gold, it would preserve you forever. So Tutankhamun had gold finger stoles, gold toe stoles, and he had gold sandals. Now, those gold sandals were removed from his feet by Dr. Douglas Derry, a good anatomist, an experienced anatomist. He was in charge of the mummy studies on Tut. He didn't notice a club foot. When he took the sandals off, he could see the ankles. No club foot. He didn't notice it. Now, I'll show you the sandals. They're kind of neat. Yeah. Aren't they great?
Yeah.
They imitate They imitate the reeds that were used to make real sandals, right? You can see they're reeds that are sewn together. They're just beautiful. But let me say another reason why I don't think he had a club foot. In Tutankhamun's tomb were dozens of sandals and shoes. And they're symmetrical. If he walked on his foot, one would be worn more than another. But they're perfectly symmetrical. So I really don't think he had a club foot. Let me go further. This is the mummy once they got it out of the coffin, and to bury it, they put it back on a sand tray. Now they really ripped it apart. I mean, you can see that it's not quite articulated. The shoulder is higher than it really should be. But the point I want to make is down here, the lower limbs. Now, if Tut really had a club foot and walked on the sides, you'd have involvement in the bones. The bones would be deformed in the lower limb, the tibia and fibula. But they're perfectly normal. As a matter of fact, they were x-rayed by R.G. Harrison in the 80s, and he never noticed any club foot or anything unusual. So it just didn't make sense that this thing, that the fragile pharaoh theory just didn't work, right? So now I wondered, if Tutankhamun wasn't a fragile pharaoh, could he have gone into battle? I mean, maybe he's a warrior. Now, he showed himself as a warrior. Let me go one more slide here. This is going to be important to my theory of Tut as a warrior. This is the Avenue of Sphinxes. You may be familiar with it. It's in Luxor, and it connects Karnak Temple with Luxor Temple. It's about 1.5 miles long, and it was used for religious processions. About 10, 15 years ago, the Antiquity Service got the idea it would be neat to open it up for tourists who could walk all the way the 1.5 miles, the procession between the two temples. But of course, at that time, there were houses in between. So it took 10 years to buy the houses, tear them down, prepare it for tourists. But when they were tearing down the houses, they discovered at the foundations of the houses blocks that were taken from the ancient temples of Luxor. 2,000 of them. And most of them came from Luxor Temple. And as a matter of fact, the Oriental Institute, the Chicago House people, they were great restorers. They put some of the blocks back on the walls. You could figure out where they went. But among these blocks, these 2,000 blocks, were a couple of hundred that were different. The carving was different, the style was different, the proportions were different. But more important, they had Tutankhamun's name on it. They came from Tutankhamun's mortuary chapel, a temple where Tutankhamun intended to be worshipped forever. But he was erased from history for a reason. Well, his father was a heretic, and they wanted to erase all trace of that. So his mortuary temple was taken down. But 200 of these blocks were found. And Ray Johnson, a really great scholar at Chicago House, he's an artist and an Egyptologist, both. And what he figured out was let me show you, that's one of the blocks. Okay, now let your eyes get used to it. I know it's not clear, but it will be in a second. What we're looking at is a Tutankhamun boast. Tutankhamun is saying that he went into battle, and when he came home from Syria with his ship, hanging from the mast was a Syrian prisoner. See, there's a cage, and in it is a Syrian. You can tell by the garb and the beard. So at least Tutankhamun in this case is boasting that he went to battle and came back with a prisoner hanging from the mast of his ship. But it gets better. More gruesome. Now, this is Ray Johnson's reconstruction of a wall from Tutankhamun's mortuary temple. The dark lines are the actual blocks that he had to work with. The rest he is filling in because he knows what the scenes might be like given those few blocks. Now, what you have are soldiers, Egyptian soldiers. We can tell that by their hair, by their shields, and on their spears are hands, severed hands. That's how the ancient Egyptians counted the enemy slain in battle. Right? That's how they did it. And this is Tutankhamun's mortuary chapel where he's showing he went into battle and they came back with lots of hands. Now, this is the only place I've ever seen in ancient Egypt where you see the hands skewered on spears. It's a traditional scene, the battle scene where they're counting the hands. That's traditional, but you don't see it that way. This is before any of the other scenes. Now, let me show you how you see it traditionally. Now, again, your eyes will get used to it in a second. These are the hands. Piles of hands. That's how it's usually shown.
God.
And they're piled up, and there are military scribes who are counting the number. And over here, by the way, these are the numbers. If you can make out this like 2 lotus flowers, that's the hieroglyph for 1,000. So that's 1,000, 2,000. There's a curl, that's 100. The hoops are tens, right? So there's 7 of them. And then the single strokes are the single digits. So it's 2,175. That's how many enemy were killed.
Oh.
That is the traditional way of showing how many enemy have been defeated. So Tut is showing himself as having hands on spears. He's really saying, I'm a warrior. But that's not all. Chariots were an important part of warfare. They were like the fighter jets of the ancient world. And this is Howard Carter, the discoverer of Tutankhamun's tomb. That's his drawing of a chariot. He went out to Egypt at the age of 17 as an artist to work on expeditions, and he learned archaeology there, and he became very proficient at it, but he was a terrific artist. And he is doing a drawing here of a chariot that was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun's grandparents, great-grandparents. And this is not a war chariot, though. This is a ceremonial chariot where officials could go on processions and things like that. But that's Carter's drawing. Now, up until the discovery of by Carter of Tut's tomb, that was the only chariot we had. But Tut had 6 chariots in his tomb. That is a scene on a wooden chest in Tutankhamun's tomb. And Tut is shown in his chariot with the reins of the horse are around his waist. He's controlling it all by himself. In this scene, this battle scene, the pharaoh always takes center stage and there's nobody else in the picture. It's impossible to control 2 horses in a chariot with your waist, but he doesn't want anybody else there. So he's on the chariot, he's shooting his arrows, they're the defeated enemy, and there's his horses. Now, curious thing, I always wondered about this. Can you see, guys in the back, can you see it? There's a little circular disc, a little disc behind the horse's neck. It's a solar disc, right there. I always wondered, what is that? It appears in all the scenes of the chariots and the horses. This is 100 years later, after Tut, but you see it? I think it's clear for the guys in the back there. You see it there, and the same thing, reins around his waist, and the pharaoh is shooting the arrows. But what is this? Well, I'll show you. I think I'll show you. I think I'm right. That is an actual chariot from Tutankhamun's tomb. Harry Burton, the photographer, did some color photographs, and that's the chariot. Chariots were very complex things. Very complex. They were always breaking. You always saw scenes on tomb walls of people fixing chariots. They're made of 3 kinds of wood. You need light wood for the body because you want to be able to move fast and maneuver. The axle had to be really strong, a different kind of wood. And then you had to get wood that could bend to make the wheels. And it's very, very complex to build a chariot. And so they were expensive, but they were crucial in battle. Now, that was found in Tutankhamun's tomb, that objet. It's a falcon, and on his head, it's Horus, the falcon god, and on his head is a solar disk. And if you know hieroglyphs, you can see that it has Tutankhamun's name on it. One of his names, Neb Keperu, the scarab, Re, Neb Keperu Re. So it's Horus, Tutankhamun. Now, what's important is the bottom of it. You can see there's a groove, kind of like a tunnel, carved in the base of the statue. I'll show you a drawing in a minute. I see people going, can't see it. I'll show you a drawing in a second. I claim that this is the first hood ornament in the history of the world. No, it is. All right, that's a drawing, okay? Now, the groove, it fit on the pole that connects the chariot with the horses. It fits right there. It's tied on. Right? And the circle that we see behind the horse's neck, that's that. They're showing you that there's a hood on it. So when the pharaoh went into battle, he had Horus on, in front of him and his solar disk, and that's what they're showing when they show the battle scene. So anyway, Tutankhamun had 6 chariots. I think it's starting to look like he really was a warrior. I mean, he's showing himself in battle. He doesn't have a club foot, but there's a little bit more evidence. That. Anybody figure out what it is?
It's the armor?
It's armor.
Yeah.
It's armor. Tutankhamun, in his tomb, had a suit of armor. Now, it's pretty much forgotten. One of the reasons we now know about these things is that you know that they're building in Egypt a new museum called the Grand Egyptian Museum. It's been opening for 7 years. Every year. It's next year. Next year, I think it really will open. I really do. But anyway, they're moving all of the Tutankhamun objects from the old museum in Cairo at Tahrir Square to the GEM, the Grand Egyptian Museum. And for the first time, they're pulling out things they haven't seen in years, including this box of armor, right? Now, what they are is they're leather. They're leather like scales. They look like little Egyptian shields, actually. And they were sewn onto linen and worn. Now, Andre Veldemir is the leather expert on ancient Egypt objects, and he studied these. And he came to the conclusion he could see wear marks on them. It was actually worn. Right? So Tutankhamun had a set of armor in his tomb that was actually worn. So I think this notion of Tutankhamun as a fragile pharaoh it's just wrong. I think it's wrong, and I think the needle is going towards, he went into battle. I think he really did. But that's just one example. When I'm doing this book, things didn't come out the way I thought they would. I thought he was a fragile pharaoh till I went deeper. Let me show you another case, one more case, then I'll get to stolen objects, which John Fried asked me to talk about. One more case, I think this didn't go the way I thought it would. Now, this is a drawing of Tutankhamun by Winifred Brunton. She was an artist who did a book on the kings and queens of Egypt, and she represented them based on historical data. So, for example, everything there is real. These things were found in the tomb. And she chose to represent him with this dagger. It's a very special dagger. It's made of iron. It's got a gold sheath, a rock crystal pommel, and an iron blade. Now that's very special. Egypt did not have iron. End of story. They had copper first, then they had bronze. Now bronze is a mixture of 2 metals, copper and tin, right? Now copper is very soft. And the reason is kind of molecular. It's a very simple molecular thing. The reason metals are soft is that when the molecules align, they slide. So that gives you a soft metal. Tin is also soft. They align. But when you put the two together, you get a hard metal. It was like a miracle. And the reason is kind of simple. When you heat it and mix them, they form a lattice. And they interlock so they don't slide. So bronze is hard. That's great. But iron is harder. But Egypt did not have iron. But he's got an iron dagger. Now there's a clue as to where they got the iron. Let me show you the other daggers in his tomb. Just there. That's our iron blade here. That's a bronze. There's a phrase in Egypt, Bia Empet, iron from the sky. It's meteoritic. The blade was hammered out of a meteorite. Right? Which is, now there's been new research on this blade, which is kind of cool. Let me show you. Using Google Earth, which archaeologists do all the time now, they located a meteor crater in Egypt. It's very remote. It's southwest, and it's so remote that it's never been visited. Right? You can tell because there's no tire tracks, that kind of thing. That's how you do it. It took the geologist 4 days to get to it because you're going over desert, dunes, slow. Show you another, give you a better idea. There, that's the crater, and there they are, the geologists. And around it are thousands of fragments of the meteorite, right? Of the meteor. But, and this is again where it doesn't turn out the way you think it's going to turn out. The iron didn't come from there. It looks so good. I mean, meteors have signatures. They're different. Each one's different. They're different percent of nickel to iron. And there's no doubt about it. Tut's dagger did not come from there. But I do have an idea where it came from. I'm going to tell you where it is. Tutankhamun's father was the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who lived in a city called Akhenaten in the desert. In the 1880s, the foreign archives of Akhenaten were found in an office, the foreign office, and it was cuneiform tablets. And on one of the tablets, the king of Mitanni, a foreigner, says, I am sending to Amenhotep III, that was his Tut's grandfather, I am sending to Amenhotep III a dagger made of gold with an iron blade. So I think that Tut is buried with his grandfather's, it's an heirloom of his grandfather's dagger. That's probably the best bet. Right? So anyway, things don't always turn out the way you think. Now, John had asked me, as I said, to talk about stolen objects from Tutankhamun's tomb. I think the reason is, you know, when my book, before my book came out, the publisher sent it, an electronic version, a PDF of it, to various newspapers and magazines, hoping to get publicity. The Guardian picked up the story about Tut's stolen objects. I had done a chapter on Tut's stolen objects. By the way, the one on the dagger, I titled the chapter, "It Came from Outer Space," just to bug the ancient alien people. I hope they're going to be very disappointed when they read it. But anyway, Oxford University Press sent the PDF of my book to various newspapers, things, and the Guardian in London, in England, the Manchester Guardian, they picked up the story about stolen objects. Because one of the things I found is that sure, Carter was stealing objects, taking him out of the tomb, Carter and Carnarvon, but it was much more widespread than anybody knew. But let me show you. Let me give you a background for why Carter and Carnarvon are stealing objects. Oh. Right? You got to understand why, and then it becomes understandable. Carter and Carnarvon were excavating when England controlled Egypt. It was colonial times, and England was running the show. It goes way back to the Suez Canal. That is a illustrated London News depiction of the building of the Suez Canal in the 1860s. Now what had happened was, and this is a big part of what happens with Tutankhamun's tomb, the Suez Canal, believe it or not. They're building the Suez Canal, and the deal is this. Egypt will supply the labor and the land. Because the Suez Canal is in Egypt. They're going to supply the labor and the land. And foreign governments will buy shares. So it will be an international consortium, and Egypt will benefit greatly from the tariffs. And that was the agreement. They started that way, with the Lesser designing it. But then what happened was, the Khedive of Egypt was conscripting labor. He was basically using the Egyptian peasants as slaves, not paying them, and they were dying because he wasn't treating them well. When England heard of this, they said, wait a second, you can't have slave labor on the Suez Canal. So the Khedive had to pay his labor, couldn't afford it, and went bankrupt. So now the Suez Canal is bankrupt, and England and France take it over. They buy all the shares. They are now controlling Egypt, right? And it goes on for years, decades. They are controlling the Suez Canal. Now, at some point, the Egyptians revolt. They don't like this. This is our canal, this is our country. Why are these foreigners getting all the money? So Al-Arabi, an Egyptian, starts a revolt in Alexandria, and England brings in ironclad ships. And what we are seeing here is another illustrated London News depiction of the bombardment of Alexandria. They start shelling Alexandria and reducing much of it to rubble. On the ships are Marines who land at Alexandria, take control, and now England is really in control of Egypt. That is the situation when Carter and Carnarvon discovered Tutankhamun's tomb. Not only that, England is in control of the finances, the economics, all of that, but the French are in control of the Antiquity Service, right? Because de Lesseps had a friend across Mariette, and he said he should take over, and he did. So, I'm just showing this. This is a typical letter written by the Antiquity Service in the 1890s, and the point I want to make is, it doesn't say Antiquity Service, it says Service des Antiquités. If you wanted to do business with the Antiquity Service, you spoke French. Everything in Egyptian Antiquity Service is in French. The letters, everything. So the Egyptians are being shut out of everything. So, when the tomb is discovered, the Egyptians are really ticked off that it's the foreigners who are controlling it. They have a series of postcards that I love. What you have here is, by the way, they're bringing out part of a chariot, one of Tutankhamun's chariots. And can you read the caption? Exploitation of Tutankhamun's tomb. Right? The exploitation of Tutankhamun's tomb. Now things are going to get worse for Carter and Carnarvon. And the reason they're going to get worse is they made terrible decisions, 2 terrible decisions. Carter made one, Carnarvon made the other. And it was because they thought they owned the tomb. I mean really owned the tomb. First, they were besieged by journalists wanting interviews, wanting photographs. And they couldn't work under those circumstances. So what does Carnarvon do? Lord Carnarvon, British Lord Carnarvon, he sells the exclusive rights to the story to the London Times. Egyptian journalists can't cover their own story. They have to get it from the London Times. And other foreign journalists are incensed. So everybody's getting riled up with Carter and Carnarvon. Then to make things worse, Carter invites the wives of his excavating team. He's got an all-star team. He's got Harry Burton as a photographer. He's got Lucas the chemist for conservation. He's got Sir Alan Gardner for translating. It's an all-star team, all Brits, And he invites their wives to a special showing of the discovery of the tomb. Great, fair enough. He doesn't invite any wives of the Egyptian officials, though. And when they ask, can the wives of the Egyptian officials have an opening, Carter says no. Right? There's a big brouhaha, and eventually, Carter is locked out of the tomb. They lock him out, right? What does Carter do? He writes a statement giving his position on the thing. You can see it's a statement which documents, the events which occurred in Egypt in the winter of 1923-4, leading to the ultimate break with the Egyptian government, right? So he writes this statement, and he's going to distribute it to his colleagues, right? As he goes abroad. Now, 1 second. Look what he has in there. This is really quotes from his statement. One of the issues is control of visitors to the tomb. That's the issue of the English wives can come, but not the Egyptian wives. If the proposed control of visitors had anything to do with the success of the undertaking, I should be the last to complain. It is not Howard Carter. Right? So he wants to control who comes and goes from his tomb, right? He's doing it as his tomb. But wait, it gets worse. Publication rights. The government claims the right to publish in the museum guides notices on the objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb. It is obviously an encroachment on the rights of the Countess, that's the Countess Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon has died now, and the Countess Carnarvon has the concession, which cannot be justified by pretending that the objects described form part of the collection of the museum. In other words, he doesn't want the Egyptian Museum to have a catalog describing the objects. He says that's his right to publish it. And worse, he says, it's not clear you're going to get them. There was a dispute about who owns the objects in the tomb. According to Carnarvon's concession, if an intact tomb was found in the Valley of the Kings, everything stays in Egypt. Otherwise, the old rule would hold. was called, because it's in French, partage, the division. The deal was, at the end of the season of excavating, they divided the finds, kind of like kids would do it. The excavator would take all the finds and divide it in 2 equal piles. And then the inspector from the Antiquity Service would come and pick one of the 2 piles. And that's how they divided it. Then the excavator could take the other pile back to his museum or his university. That had been going on for years. But now, it's an intact tomb. They don't get anything. They're arguing, though, it was robbed in antiquity. There was a slight evidence that it had been robbed in antiquity, and say, well, it really is a robbed tomb. Not really. But they're going to claim that they want it. Now, here's the last thing, ownership. The articles described do not yet, and possibly some of them, never will form part of the collection of the museum. Howard Carter. So he's still saying, they're not yours. So these 2 guys, and this is, remember, this is the background to why they're stealing things. This is the background to their mentality of this is our tomb. We've done this. They think they own it. So, what do? Now, Carter goes off to give a lecture tour. He's locked out of the tomb. He goes off to give a lecture tour in North America. Okay? While he's away, the Egyptian government takes stock of what's there, what's in the tomb, what's in Carter's house. And this is one of the great masterpieces of the tomb, the lotus head of Tutankhamun. It's wood with plaster, with gesso. And they find it in a Fortnum and Mason's crate. It's in a box from from the English purveyor. And Carter has never said that he found this. He's got it in a crate, unregistered. Nobody knows about it. And immediately, the Egyptians think he's stealing it. Which may be the case, I don't know. But what happens is, his colleagues, now he's in North America, his colleagues give him excuses. They talk, now Carter, isn't it possible that you got this from Tel El Amarna when you were working there and it's not from Tut's tomb? But Carter says, no, it's from Tut's tomb. I got it when I was excavating the descending passageway. It was in the rubble. I just put it in the crate. Okay, let's give him the benefit of doubt on that one. Now, this is a pectoral. It's attached to Tutankhamun's body. It's stuck on it because it's resin. They pour the oils on them. But I think you can see there are thousands of beads, little tiny beads. That's what the dots are. Those are thousands of beads. But there are also in this pectoral gold teardrops. Okay. Can't get it off. You can't get it off. It's stuck in there, right? But let me show you what appeared on the antiquities market. Remember the gold beads? That's strung together. And that came from Howard Carter's estate. All right. Now, one thing I'd like to point out, there's more beads on that necklace than there are on the front of the pectoral, right? So it didn't come from there. What happened was, I'm pretty sure, and even Mark Gabold, this is Mark Gabold observation. Some of the beads fell in the coffin. The thread tears, the thread breaks. Some of the beads fall in the coffin, and from the bottom of the coffin you get lots of beads. Carter picks them up, takes them home, maybe to have them restrung, maybe. But then when he dies, part of his estate is sold, somebody buys the beads and restrings them in that necklace. Okay, so far we've got something we can explain. He thinks he owns it, he can take them home, he's just going to have it restrung. Okay. This is his drawing. Howard Carter, as I mentioned, was an artist. And he was meticulous. And he had index cards drawing the details of these pectorals. And that's what he's doing here. He's drawing it, he's got the beads, there are the gold teardrops, right? And he even shows that there was a terminal. The ends of the pectoral had 2 little falcon heads. Right there, he's drawing it. Now the point I want to make is this. He labels it. It's number 256 TTT. Carter labels everything. Then it gets shipped to the Cairo Museum. And it gets a Cairo Journal d'Entrée number. This never made it to Cairo. This piece never made it to Cairo, right? That's the pectorals. They're in an American museum. Right? Right? Those are the terminals, the Horus terminals. But I think, let me put it this way, if Carter were going to steal it, Would he record it? I don't think so. It was, again, this case of ownership. I can take it home, I can do this. So I don't think it's quite as heinous as a lot of people want to paint it, right? But there's more. That's the pectoral. Another pectoral that shows up in an American museum, sold by Carter's estate. This is almost a duplicate of one that Harry Burton photographed in the tomb. So again, it comes from Tutankhamun's tomb. Again, it's the kind of thing that may have been taken to be restrung. Maybe. Now, another source of objects from Tutankhamun's tomb that makes its way out of the tomb. That is Howard Carter's house.
Oh.
It was called Castle Carter. It was in Luxor. He lived there for 20 years, right? And when he died, he left the house to the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York. The reason was the Met had been very helpful in excavating the tomb. Very helpful. It wasn't, how to say it, Harry Burton, the photographer, packed up the house, the contents. Had to wait till after World War II. Carter dies in '39, World War II is raging, waits till after World War II, and ships everything to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They unpack things, and in with Howard Carter's possessions, in his house, is that. A duplicate of another one in Tutankhamun's tomb. I mean, this is not just for restringing, this is a spectacular masterpiece of jewelry. And Carter had it in his house. I mean, for 10 years. I mean, he finished excavating in 1930, and he dies in '39, so he still got it, right? Now the Met, give them credit. They realized that many of these objects that came from Carter's house were from Tutankhamun's tomb. And they gave them back to the Egyptian government. Wow. They're in Cairo today, right? So that's a nice thing, and some things get repatriated. And some things don't. That is a Tutankhamun Ushapti figure. The Egyptians believed that the next world would be a continuation of this one, only air-conditioned. Right? They always show people, you know, in nice clothing and everything's nice, but you still have to do work. But you didn't want to do work, so you were buried with little statues, little statues, 365 of them, one for each day of the year, that would come to life by magic and do your work for you. Oh. They're called Ushapti statues because it comes from the verb, the ancient Egyptian verb weshev, which means to answer. So when you're called to do work, it'll answer. It'll say, here I am, right? Now Tutankhamun had more than 500 of these. They are fabulous. This is one. They're all individual sculptures in wood. Just beautiful. And one of them is in the Louvre. All right, now how did a Tutankhamun Ushapti get to the Louvre? I was at a conference about 4 months ago in France, and the director of the Louvre was there. And he was a good guy. I asked him, I said, you got a Tutankhamun Ushapti, don't you? Where did you get it? And very forthright, very straightforward, he said, we bought it from the estate of Howard Carter's secretary, but you know he didn't have a secretary. It was from his niece's estate. Howard Carter had a niece that he was very close to, very close to. And he gave it to her, I guess. Took an Ushapti and gave it to her. Now you wonder what's in his head. What's going to happen to this Ushapti eventually? But there are many things outside of the tomb that people don't know about. Now let me share one last little bit. This is the definitive biography of Howard Carter by Harry James, who is a great scholar. He was the keeper of antiquities at the British Museum and a great, great Howard Carter scholar. He talks about Carter taking things. He does. And he gives an interesting picture. Let me explain what happened. Carter had some amulets from the tomb that he kept. They're called WHEM amulet, W-H-E-M. They're little joints of meat, and they're meant to supply meat to the deceased in the next world. Carter gave one to Sir Alan Gardner, the great translator. And he didn't tell him it came from the tomb. And Gardner showed it to the curator at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, Rex Engelbach, and Engelbach said, wait a second, that's from Tutankhamun's tomb, we have a load of them here. And Gardner got really ticked off with Carter. He said, you put me in a very bad spot. Now, when Harry James talks about this incident, he only gives Howard Carter's side of the story. Let me show you. This is the quote. Carter is writing to Sir Alan Gardner. After Gardner writes and says, I'm really ticked off. Says, I think, Gardner, that on second thoughts, you will agree that it would perhaps have been kinder had you advised me upon the matter before actually taking the steps you did, especially as I see by your letter to Engelbach that dated 23rd October that I was in London at the time. So Carter's almost coming off as indignant. He's the one who's been hurt, right? And what I discovered is that Harry James' biography is slanted only one way. It's showing Carter's view of it. Let me show you what Gardner's letter looks like. I'll read it to you. I understand people in the back can't see it. Carter, I send you herewith copies of the letter received from Engelbach, together with my reply to the first of them. I'm at an angle, it's hard. You will remember that when, wait, let me see, let me get it straight on. You will remember that when you gave me the Wim amulet, told me not only that it did not come from the tomb of Tutankhamun, but that all such amulets from the tomb were deep blue, and none were light blue. The latter statement appears to be incorrect, and I deeply regret having been placed in so awkward a position. Yours, Alan Gardner. Gardner never spoke to Carter again, right? He was really ticked off. And, you know, they're treating this tomb as if it's theirs. Carter and Carnarvon are just taking things, giving it away. I'll show you one last coda surrounding Gardner's thing. Gardner, straightforward guy, writes to Engelbach, the curator of the Egyptian Museum, and says, you know, I better set things straight. Carter also gave me the seals to Tutankhamun's tomb. I gave them to my kid. Right? So there were things, they were just treating it as it's theirs to do with as they please. It's this colonial mentality, you know, it's this colonial mentality. But it's a very complex situation. I mean, you have to understand the background and why it's happening. But, you know, almost everything with Tutankhamun is sort of not what it appeared at first. And I think it's the same with the theft. There are all kinds of reasons for the different thefts. There's just, we're going to restring it, and there's also, well, it's ours, let's keep you shopping. Right? But it's a very strange situation. But I just thought I'd tell you something a little different about Tutankhamun. Any questions? That's it. I think I'm okay for time, am I? We are? Okay. Questions? Yes, I have lots of questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, so could you just clarify something for me? When you threw out these words at the beginning about concession and commission, I assume the party was Carnarvon and the French, since they were controlling, or were the Egyptians? And secondly, was the agreement that, okay, you boys can dig around here all you want, you might find something, you might not, but when you do find something, you get the honor and we get the treasure.
Okay.
I can't believe anyone would sign an agreement like that.
Okay. First, the answer is that the agreement, the concession, is with the Antiquity Service.
So that's the French.
Which is, the French are running it, but it's the Egyptian Antiquity Service. Right? It's the Egyptian Antiquity Service, Service des Antiquités, run by the French. Okay? The concession now, you want to know, does it really say you can keep the treasure?
Yeah, I mean, don't
the answer is yes.
The work and money they're spending.
The answer is yes. Almost every excavation up to Tutankhamun's time, there was a partage. You got to keep half of what you found. And that way, Egypt couldn't afford to excavate, so you got museums and other people excavating. One of the things that changes after Tutankhamun's tomb, and the reason I have the book title is Tutankhamun and the Tomb That Changed the World, it really did change the world. After Tutankhamun, people get the idea everything should stay in Egypt. And that's going to change. Now, today, when we excavate, we're excavating for knowledge. No museum or university back home is going to get any objects, right? But in the early days, yes, it was absolutely, and fabulous treasures left Egypt legally, perfectly legal.
So the fact that it was never open before is irrelevant. The fact is that at the time that it was found, they were entitled to something.
Their contract said, though, because they're working in the Valley of the Kings, the French director, Pierre Lecoq, knew if they find an intact tomb, that should stay in Egypt. So the contract said, if the tomb is intact, everything stays in Egypt. Young lady, yes.
Do they pay for the concession?
No, you don't pay
How
for
do they get the concession?
Okay, you write up a proposal, you send it to the Egyptian Antiquity Service, they review it, and if they think you have good credentials, you're going to do a good job, they give you the permission. So you don't pay for the concession. what happened with Carter and Carnarvon, by the way, is kind of interesting. Because they didn't get anything, at the end, there was a negotiation. And the Countess Carnarvon, who now succeeded with the concession, was paid $39,000, 39,000 pounds sterling, by the Egyptian government for their expenses. So the expenses were paid for Carnarvon, but nothing was kept legally.
Bob, we have time for one more question.
Time for one more question. Okay, then I got to sign books. I know I have some books. Go ahead, young lady.
About the curse of Tutankhamun.
The curse of Tutankhamun. There ain't none. Right? No curse. But the newspapers, wanting something to write about, invented the curse. So that's it. But anyway, thank you very much. I'll sign a few books if you want.
There'll be more of these to come in the future. Thank you so much for attending tonight, and stay warm. Thank you.